let me get to the budget. For the budget. So we have a problem, boss. We have a problem. I'm not going to discuss, use this as a pivot, because I think the pivot is right here. We have a serious structural problem. I've been saying this now for 3 years with the public finances of our country, and I'll put it to you very simply. Any government should be able to collect, in at least substantial measure, the taxes that it says publicly that it will collect. So if you say on February 1, 2019 that I will collect so much tax, then I expect you to collect most of it at least by February 2020, unless your tax aspirations are unreasonable. I think the government of India has had reasonable tax aspirations, and therefore the problem is it has consistently not been able to collect those taxes, and the shortfalls are large. Since you're students of economics, most of you, this is best done in terms of percentage of GDP, because ultimately that's your tax base. This rupees crores business can confuse you. The tax GDP ratio last year was short by 1% of GDP. That is what they said they would collect. On February 1, 2018, we discovered in July 2019 they had collected 1% of GDP less. This year, what they said they would collect in July 2019, they have collected 0.7% of GDP less, and the final figures are still not out. 0.7. So that's one problem. You're not collecting the taxes you wish to collect. The second problem is that this government, like many others, has decided that it wishes to finance its current expenditures by selling assets. That's what disinvestment is. I'm not going into good and bad. Okay? That you don't have taxes, so the next thing you want to do is sell some assets and use that money to fund your expenditure, not to buy other assets, to fund your expenditure. This government for the last 3 years has failed to sell the assets that it said it would sell, and therefore disinvestment receipts are consistently falling short year after year after year, and this year it fell short by 0.2% of GDP. So that's the fiscal math for you. Revenue receipts is tax plus non-tax revenues. Those are the numbers in rupees crores, just below the dark line, which is GDP. And then you have net tax revenue, which is after you give the states money, what's left in the center. And then you have non-tax revenue. And then you have disinvestment. Okay. So look at non-tax revenue. In 2014-15, look at net tax revenue, the second row. In 2014-15, net tax revenue was 7.25% of GDP. It then fell, and now the latest aspiration is that they will collect exactly what they collected in 2014-15. That is dubious because, as you can see from the 1920 numbers, they fell short. How have they been making this up? Through non-tax revenues. What in non-tax revenues? Well, there is something called the Reserve Bank of India in Bombay, and they have dividends. And this government has decided in its wisdom that the Reserve Bank of India should give them more dividends than they used to historically. And they have public sector enterprises, some of which still make profits and have surpluses. So basically, most of that increase in non-tax revenue is as a result of increased RBI dividend and surpluses of public sector enterprises. And then you have this disinvestment ka khab. 0.5% of GDP, then 0.51 was the aspiration. They collected 0.32, and watch that number. Next year they want to collect 0.93. Okay? So that's the math on the where the money is coming from. They're only, other than borrowing, this is all they have. Any government. Okay. So there's a big hole in the revenue side, right? Just look at 1920. If you have collected only 1,50,000 crores, when you wanted to collect 1,64,000 crores.
69.
Sorry?
69.
Sorry, 15 lakhs. This is terrible. Okay, point percentage of GDP. I don't like all this. I put it there because people say these rupees close. I don't get it. So dekho, there's a shortfall of 0.7% of GDP, which is many lakh crores. Okay. 1 lakh something crores is the shortfall. Correct. That's the shortfall. About 15 lakh crores is the shortfall. So, but non-tax revenues have gone up slightly. So if you do it, the math in terms of percentage of GDP, you lost 0.7 up there. You're made up 0.16 now. Got it? Just subtract B minus RE. So 0.7 minus 0.16 is 0.54% of GDP. Less money. What was the fiscal deficit slippage this year? 0.5. They said 3.3. They borrowed 3.8. Correct? 0.5 minus 0.54 gives you what? Still gives you a negative number. And then you add disinvestment to that, you get 0.2 something negative. So in short, this is important because before the budget, all sorts of people write. And again, there are students here, please understand this. Don't make this silly textbook error that if a government is running a greater fiscal deficit, that's an expansionary fiscal policy. It's not. Because the purpose is, what are you using the deficit for? So if you're collecting less taxes and using the deficit just to fund the shortfall in expenditures, which I've shown you, tax to GDP ratio minus 0.7, disinvestment minus 0.2, increase in fiscal deficit plus 0.5. It does not even cover the whole left by this shortfall in tax revenues and shortfall in disinvestment receipts. Your entire fiscal deficit, every penny of it, has been used to make up for a shortfall, not to increase spending. And as a consequence, you thought, or you didn't think, I didn't think certainly. I kept writing about it and people kept calling me a fiscal hawk. That's not the point. I kept saying, if you read the article I wrote in Mint, that structurally the government is in no position to increase spending, even if it increases the fiscal deficit. All right. So I want to tell you this because you have to get out of this silly argument. You know, if people say the fiscal deficit should not go up, you're a hawk. I didn't say that. I said you may have to raise the fiscal deficit. But when you raise the fiscal deficit, you will do it to plug a hole in tax revenues and not the other way around. Not going to spend 1 penny extra. Okay? As a consequence of raising the fiscal deficit. The on-book fiscal deficit. So I've just shown you how there was a shortfall left over. You've all got that? Minus 0.9 on the revenue side, plus 0.5 on the fiscal deficit side, whole of 0.4. So this budget is in fact a contractionary budget. Because total expenditure has contracted from the desired aspiration in July of 13.63% of GDP to 13.2% of GDP. Wow. We are in serious trouble. Because everyone wanted the government to increase the fiscal deficit to increase expenditure. So what the government did was increase the fiscal deficit but contracted expenditure. What can be worse than this? You increase the fiscal deficit and you shrink expenditure. Because you can't collect taxes to the amount you said and you can't disinvest to the amount you said. Gets worse. The entire increase in capital expenditure that they made so much of is just a measly 0.05% of GDP, and all of it has come from contracting revenue expenditure. So that's expenditure switching that has resulted in a marginal increase in capital expenditure, which means the entire brunt of the of the fiscal deficit, the larger magnitude of it, has basically gone into revenue expenditure. And so the revenue deficit has gone up slightly, but the fiscal deficit has gone up by 0.5%. That's the math up to 1920 RE. Now if you look at the gross tax receipts number, this one, revenue receipts, you'll see that the contraction there, right, of 0.45, and then you have net tax revenue to the center. What you get essentially is that the shortfall should be divided as should be more or less equiproportional, but actually the states suffer a little more. And this happens because दीवार पिक्चर में कहते थे ना, those of you understand Hindi, the rest please forgive me, I can't translate this, कि मेरे पास तेरे पास क्या है, मेरे पास वहाँ है. तो सेंटर के पास क्या है? सेंटर के पास सेस है. ये शब्द आप याद रखिए, सेस. So you have a tax cut that is given. That tax cut has to be borne equiproportionately by the center and by the states. But the cess has not been cut, and the cess is not shareable with the states. So when the center cuts taxes, the divisible pool contracts, but the cesses do not contract, and therefore the pain of a tax cut is felt disproportionately by the states relative to the center. And that is the reason why the shortfall, the fiscal stress, is impacting the states. Abhi aayega picture unke liye, more than the center, something that the 15th Finance Commission has very conveniently ignored. Now, I love this phrase in India, quality of expenditure. We use it, a lot of the stuff we do is very communist. So in India, quality of expenditure is like capital is good, revenue is bad. In fact, it is very communist. In Vietnam, even today, they have a rule that your revenue expenditure cannot rise by more than 1/5 of your capital expenditure rise. So if you want to increase revenue expenditure, doesn't matter whether you need it or not, you have to increase capital expenditure 5 times. I'm not going into the good and bad of it. But if you look at the quality of expenditure for the government of India as a whole, WHOLE, there's a small problem. Problem is, I define committed expenditure here as expenditure on establishment, salaries, wages, by khata, not really cuttable. GST cess, which is in and out, interest payments, which are what they are, and statutory and finance commission transfers. So if you look at the total expenditure of government, between 6.8 and 7.9% of GDP is what is projected going forward. And at the moment, it sort of hovers between 6.8 and 7. So it's going to go up in future, according to the medium-term fiscal statement. But at the moment, it's this much. That's about, if you remember the 13% number, that's about half of government expenditure is locked down. There you go. Okay. So the percentage of total expenditure, it's slightly more than half. इसका आप कुछ नहीं कर सकते हैं in terms of expenditure switching. So there's only the remaining half of government expenditure that you can switch. And by the way, I should point out to you that many of my professional colleagues tell me that I'm very generous in only stipulating that this is committed expenditure. In government, for example, it is the practice that if you've already started a scheme, building a statue in Gujarat or something, then if that is incomplete, you take that as part of committed expenditure also. I've not done that. I'm assuming the government can stop building statues, for example. Yeah. So I've been very generous. If you take other definitions, they're much more stringent. But even then, half is a lot, man. Half is a lot. Now, for uncommitted expenditure, and this is very controversial, and I hope Manik will chip in on this. I calculate that spending on agriculture grows by 13%. That is the only number I found on the, what I would call expenditure on public goods side. For example, pensions has gone up by 14%. But if you actually look at spending on health, education, stuff that government is supposed to spend on, right? इससे बड़ा कुछ नहीं है. इससे बड़ा कुछ नहीं है. Everything else, and remember, nominal GDP growth last year was 6.5. So I did an exercise, I do it every year, where I look at each expenditure item and see whether it went up by equal to or more than the nominal growth rate. Otherwise, it is shrinking in terms of percentage of GDP, right? Every single item that I looked at of any significance, other than urban development, grew at less than the nominal growth rate. So hona hi tha, because you've had a cut, in effect, you've had a contraction, right? Not an expansion. And therefore, this entire infrastructure pipeline scheme, blah, blah, dhanadhan, I found about 12,500 crores. I'm a bit puzzled because the FM in her speech said 23,000 crores. I couldn't find it. I looked through the whole budget. I only found 12,500 crores spending on the expenditure pipeline. Okay, so education is down, health is down, energy is down, rural development is down, or kuch bolo, urban development is not down, but small, it's about 7.8%. Sab kuch kata hai. And the reason for this, And the reason for this is, again, to recapitulate. Center is collecting less taxes year after year than they say they would collect. They then want to finance spending through disinvestment, and year after year, they are disinvesting less than they would say. Until this year, they said, okay, we are trying to control the fiscal deficit. This year, they have not controlled the fiscal deficit, but expenditure has still gone down. And because half of expenditure is committed expenditure, the other half, almost everything has gone down. And therefore, you're sitting in the middle of a slowdown in contractionary mode, not because this is the serious bit, not because we want to be contractionary, but because fiscal performance is making it unavoidable. That's the worrying bit, to be contractionary. This is not a policy choice. This is a consequence of policy failure. This is not a policy choice. It's a consequence of policy failure. And nobody in this government that I know of, well, I don't know any people in this government, but nobody in this government that I know of, rhetorically speaking, wanted a contraction this year. I mean, if they did, I'd really be interested in why. Okay, I'm not a fiscal hawk, but I like fiscal prudence, and even I would not have argued this year that you should contract. The only plea was, and the government fulfilled it, please tell me, for every rupee you spend, what is the growth payback you're going to get and when? Don't tell me it will come in 4 years. Tell me in this year when it will come. But wo to chodo. Every rupee of the fiscal deficit has been, jawab mil jaye. Every rupee of the fiscal deficit has been used to make up for a shortfall in tax revenues and disinvestment receipts. मैं बार-बार ये दोहरा रहा हूँ. I'm repeating this again and again because it's very, very important conceptually to understand this. Every single rupee in the fiscal deficit increase has been used to compensate for a shortfall in tax revenues and disinvestment. Not one rupee has been used to expand spending. And spending itself has contracted. People ask me whether this 3.8% is achievable. Yeah, why not? It's achievable. You go and borrow more. There's a twist coming, I'll tell you about it. But there is also 0.8% of GDP, according to the government of India, which is off budget. Very transparent this year. Actually, they were transparent last year also. But people don't look at the budget properly. No? So, you should look at the budget properly. It's a serious, you should take the budget seriously, even if the government doesn't. So the numbers were there. There's something called Statement 27 of the expenditure profile, matchable with the liability statement on the revenue receipts, matchable with your medium-term fiscal documentation. And if you add all those, you get it. This time they've given it to you in an annex. It's about 0.8% of GDP. But most of this 0.8%, it is very clear from that statement, is going to fund unfunded liabilities of the Food Corporation of India. So if you think that's counter-recessionary, great. The counterfactual is that if we were not in a slowdown, then the Food Corporation would not have had these unfunded liabilities. That's not credible. So that's not going, that's just going to plug another hole again, this time in the Food Corporation of India. That's the number. So off-budget borrowing, which is government fully serviced bonds. So this is important. I'll just take a minute analytically on this. See, analytically you must remember the CAG is completely wrong. Don't engage as economists in counterfactuals. What is on budget in terms of government borrowing as opposed to public sector borrowing is that borrowing which leads to commitments on budget for the government in future. The rest is bad corporate governance. So if Hindustan Petroleum borrows with sanction from its board to build a Sardar Patel statue and funds it out of corporate profits, then that's not off budget. That's bad governance of Hindustan Petroleum. But when the government says, you borrow and I will fund your principal repayment and interest, that is on budget. So that first row refers to that sort of borrowing. Okay. The second row refers to something else, which is there is a small savings fund, which is supposed to be invested and the proceeds utilized to pay the interest on this fund and principal repayments. You can lend that money in the fund to anybody. Central government is choosing to borrow from it. Earlier state governments did. But because that fund is in the public account, it is not calculated as part of the borrowing which is recorded in the calculus of the fiscal deficit. Okay. So if you add the two, you get roughly 0.8% of GDP constant, 0.85, 0.84, 0.85, 0.84. So the real total borrowing by central government is 3.8 plus 0.8, 4.6. All right. That remaining 0.8, large part of it is going to fund unfunded liabilities of the Food Corporation of India. So that's the off-budget story. It's actually not the main story. You know, I mean, unless you take a sort of bahi khata, a munim approach to it. Say, सब कुछ आंकड़े होने चाहिए. आंकड़े हैं, but the government has chosen not to count it as part of the fiscal deficit. And SSS, I can understand, the accounting problem, the other one, yeah, whatever. But it's 0.8 going to food corporation. Oh. So these targets are not imminently, that's by RA's fault and my fault for not catching her, eminently achievable. Unless, and for this we will wait till April, and I will be watching like a hawk. Unless what happened last year happens this year. So last year what happened was that the revised estimates were short by were greater by 1% of GDP than the provisional accounts. I caught that, and Nitin Desai caught it, and more or less no one else did within 24 hours of the budget. Because you know, we are very old-fashioned. मेरे ज़माने में ना economic survey का एक ही volume आता था, volume 2. Then all this fluff started. I think it started with Kaushik. ये volume 1, ये क्या jam, चक्का jam, अभिमन्यु और पता नहीं, pretty diagrams. अच्छे pretty है, बड़े pretty है, very selfieable. You can take selfie with the economic survey. You can't take a selfie with volume 2. It's very boring. It says public finance, monetary policy, fiscal policy. But it's very important to read because you actually get there a take. And last year, the economic survey people, Mand Buddhi hai, economic division, they took, as good economists do, the latest numbers. So the provisional accounts last year in July were out. So when I opened that volume 2, I found the numbers were completely different from the budget. So I used those numbers, government numbers. This year, we don't have it because this is February. We will have those numbers in April. So unless what happened last year happens this year again, in which case things are even worse than the government is saying. And there are some indications that may be true because you look at tax revenue growth across the year, the trend growth rate up to February is way lower than last year. They'll have to collect about 2/3 of their total tax revenues between February and March. That being said, a lot of tax revenues are collected between February and March, but 2/3 I've never seen. We shall see. Or the disinvestment shortfall is even lower. Because they said 60,000 crores, so far we have done about 18,000 crores, not even half. हो जाएगा, सब कुछ हो जाएगा. कोई है तो मुमकिन है. लेकिन देखना पड़ेगा बॉस, अप्रैल में. पिछले साल तो मुमकिन नहीं था, अब देखना पड़ेगा. Because, and the reason it is worrying is that because last year there was this problem, the distance we've had to climb is much greater, then we had a slowdown. And next year if we have this problem continuing, then the distance on the road to recovery will be even higher and will be even more of a hole. Yes. So that's the very simple story of the budget macro this year. There's very little point arguing about the impact of the budget on the slowdown, etc. if all it's doing is filling holes. I don't want to keep repeating myself. I'm only repeating myself because like robotics professors, the commentators in the press, 80% of them go on talking about expansion, contraction, like the whole deficit has been used for expansionary fiscal policy, etc., etc. I don't know why they're doing that when there's such a big hole. You know, I mean, we're not robotics professors, we're economists. So we should actually, you know, behave like economists and look at why the fiscal deficit was organized. So I have one final point to make. I was a member of the FRBM committee. And it's very fashionable to use this jargon. It's a bit like saying counter-cyclical, when all I see is a polynomial in 3 degrees. Nobody can tell me why that is a cycle. I've been asking everybody. They're saying a cycle because it's a polynomial. The polynomial cycle kab se ho gaya, mujhe nahi malum. But anyway, so like that, I mean, it's a simple question, right? How, you show me a polynomial and say this is the cycle. How is it a cycle? Or you show me output gap. How do you come to potential output? Was it astrology? God told you? No, that is potential output. But how is it potential output? Anyway. So similarly, people are very fond of saying things like escape clauses. So basically an escape clause is what? That there is a rule and you commit to that rule except under circumstances which you specify where the rule will be relaxed, and you specify by how much and how you will get back to the rule. That's called an escape clause. So in the FRBM committee, we had 3 criteria for the relaxation of the rule. The first was mine, frankly, which is undue and unusual agricultural stress. That's what happened this year. Second was a deviation in the trend growth rate by a certain amount. I forget how much, but it's not deviated by that much this year. It was 2% for 3 quarters or something like that. 3% for 3 quarters. Yes, that's right. Because I remember pleading with the former governor that this is too large. I'm not saying it's not. It's fair. 3% is a lot. But anyway, you have to do these things by consensus, so we agreed. The third was a total vago one, which is fine, which is something about structural changes of far-reaching significance that allows the government to do something. Now, that is up to you to define what is a structural change. But that's not the point. The point is, first, that the clause was to have been invoked on the advice of an independent fiscal council, which I had hoped to chair. But the bureaucrats decided not to have an independent fiscal council because bureaucrats don't like independent something. They want independence. So anything that you do that is independent reduces their independence. And it's a weak government, so they listen to the bureaucrats, so we don't have a fiscal council. Sure, no fiscal council. But analytically, and the government accepted this when they accepted the recommendations minus the fiscal council, the government was supposed to come up with a roadmap which would specify how you would return to the fiscal, the path, how you get off the wagon again. How you return to sobriety, how you get onto the fiscal deficit path. Analytically explain this and put it before Parliament. Not a word has been presented in the budget, or certainly not in the economic survey, on why this clause has been invoked and what the analysis behind it is. And I take grave objection to that, because that is trivializing a rule. And if you trivialize a rule, there's no point having one. I would have been much happier if the government had said, don't like FRBM, it's very bad. Said something silly like it is based on Maastricht. Lots of people say that. It's not true. It's very bad. So we decided 2 years ago it was good, but now it's very bad. We're giving it up. That's okay. But if you accept a rule and then you trivialize it by not doing what the rule says you should do, then you're being irresponsible. And that is what the government has been. So, we have an increased fiscal deficit, we have no plan on how we'll return to fiscal prudence, and we have no admission by government. It should have been okay that as a policy rule I've decided I'm going to run high deficits, go to hell. That's fine. Government is allowed to do that. We have that fiscal deficit has been used only to plug a hole in tax revenues. And it is very difficult in the FRBM to say this, and that is why the government has not done so. So, notwithstanding airy statements like escape clause, this budget is a weak budget. It shows fundamental structural weakness. It is borrowing to cover shortfalls in revenues. It is invoking things called escape clauses and trivializing them because it cannot afford to admit that you are borrowing to cover shortfalls in revenues. The situation going forward is going to be even grimmer, since there is no plan to get back on the path of fiscal stability, if not prudence. And that is the rather, I think, depressing situation we find ourselves in. The only takeaway, and I'll conclude with that, is please let us not talk about macro fiscal policy or even its components as anything that is going to help you get out of this awful slowdown we are in, because as I've shown you, there simply isn't the money. Thank you.